I'm Ben Cording. I'm a lawyer from Tenants Victoria, and I'm with VCOSS answering some of your questions around renter rights. If a renter causes damage to a property due to mental health challenges, but has repaired the property, can the landlord still evict them? It's a really great question because a lot of us that have got mental health challenges will sometimes have something that happens where the property is damaged for whatever reason. Even if I don't repair it straight away, there's no automatic process where the landlord can turn around and go, oh, that's unacceptable, out you go. There's a process. And as part of that process, you start with getting a notice to vacate. And in this case, it would be a notice that you've caused damage either intentionally or recklessly. And when we talk about mental health, that's a fairly big and challenging question to get to the bottom of. But even if we do come to the point of saying, yes, I caused it intentionally or recklessly, there's also now a process within Victoria that applies to all notices to vacate and when the landlord wants you to move out, which is called the reasonable and proportionate test. And that allows the tribunal to take into account a whole bunch of things about how often has this happened, what's the extent of the damage, have you tried to fix it, have you tried to make good. So in a situation where the renters fixed the property, it's really unlikely you're actually going to get evicted. Some landlords might dispute whether you've fixed it well enough, and it's okay to let that sort of stuff go to VCAT. VCAT can take into account the fact that you tried to fix it up. And we know that with a lot of people that go to VCAT, they're really concerned around going, oh, hey, I've got this particular condition which makes it really hard for me to regulate, or I might even have an addiction and, I was in a situation that wasn't great. And we want to make sure that we're protected, that that information's not going to get shared on record and be there forevermore. Under a piece of legislation called the Open Courts Act, we can actually ask VCAT to say, look, this is really relevant, I want to share it with the tribunal, but I want the decision, if you do write it up, to be anonymised, which it might, instead of saying Ben Cording, it might say, BC2. And so that allows me to share that information without it necessarily going into the public domain. And that can be really important for so many of our clients. We all know that our mental health can be fragile at the best of times, and certainly in a context where someone's facing eviction, we want to give them the best chance, but we also want to recognise that that information is really important and is something that the individual should have control over. So if damage is caused to the property, get some advice if you get a notice to vacate particularly. And if you make efforts to fix it up, absolutely, that's the right thing to do. It can be really difficult if there is damage to the property and someone's had really poor mental health over a prolonged period of time. There will be responsibility in most cases around it, unless a person's, just completely without capacity. But in most cases, people will be deemed to have a fair bit of capacity around cleaning and, making sure that you don't damage the property. So if you've got a person that's got really complex needs, engaging what the other supports that they might need around them to prevent it happening in the future is just as important as stopping the eviction from happening. The next one we've got here is, does VCAT consider the financial circumstances of the clients when making decisions? The answer is it depends. It depends on what the issue is about. So do they consider it with rent arrears? Absolutely they do. In other situations where it might be about the landlord wanting to get their property back, there can be circumstances where it will be less relevant. So access to housing, we know that when there's someone that's at risk of homelessness, we can't use that to indefinitely prevent the landlord from getting their property back. So when we talk about rent increases particularly, at the moment, that's one of the ones where they don't consider the renter's financial situation. So it's purely a market-based test. So they look at other properties, 4-bedroom brick in a similar area, how much is that going for? They don't consider the impact of the rent increase on that renter or their financial situation. That may, however, change. So with the recent housing statement bill that's been passed through the government and will eventually become legislation likely in November, the ministers and the government will have the power to possibly introduce whether or not financial hardship or financial circumstances are a relevant consideration in relation to rent increases. So we'll have to wait and see for that one. But it's an exciting time. As I said, we have historically had that in previous legislation. The sky didn't fall in, so hopefully it may come back. We'll see. Next question is, my understanding is that an agent must give 7 days notice before an inspection. Is it legal not to be able to reschedule? So this can be a really tricky one. So when we're talking about a 7-day notice, in most situations, this might be talking about when they do a general inspection. So they can't do a general inspection within the first 3 months of the tenancy starting, and they can only do it once every 6 months or not more often than once every 6 months. In terms of negotiating on the day, once they've given that notice, There's no obligation for them to negotiate for this particular ground for entry. There are other notices where they might want to come in for sales, photos and inspections and stuff, and there is an obligation to negotiate and reach a suitable time. But in the case of a general inspection, once they've given that notice, they are entitled to enter. A renter has an obligation to permit the entry. It doesn't mean you have to take the day off work and open up the door and show them around, but they can actually enter when you're not there. And so we know a lot of renters go, well, I do want to take the day off work and I do want to stay there, and that's completely fair enough. In terms of rescheduling, that's a bit of negotiation between the parties, but as far as the formal requirements are, once they've given that notice, the entry can take place. It does need to be within reasonable hours, so they can't sort of be coming around at night, 9 p.m. at night, and they can't stay longer than necessary. So it's really an important thing that we do preserve people's rights in the home. There is some regulation around the taking of photos for advertising when they're going to sell the property or reletting the property. If you're a victim survivor of family violence, so you've got an intervention order in place, the language is protected person, you can actually request that be done just by inspection. So there are some entry grounds where they do open inspections as well. One of the recent changes has been when they come to do an open inspection, particularly if they're selling, not so much if they're showing for new renters or the next renters, you get $30 a day or half a day's rent, which is good. There's no requirement that tells us when that needs to be paid. You may want to say you can't come in until you pay the money. We're waiting to see whether or not the right time for the payment is decided by VCAT. And then lastly, we have, why can't CAV issue on-the-spot fines to rental providers who breach the Residential Tenancy Act like they can for other businesses? Great question. They can. Under sections 510, I think it's capital B and C, they can actually issue infringements. And so when the minimum standards have come in, Consumer Affairs has started a task force. I think over about 90 odd fines. This was October last year. They have issued almost $500,000 worth of fines. So there's definitely the capacity to do that. There is an enforcement policy which is on Consumer Affairs Victoria website about when they will and will not issue infringements, prosecute, or when they send warning letters. What we would tell most people is that it's so important to make sure that when you do see that an offence has happened, that you report it. One of the most common ones is where the bond's not lodged. We know that there are a lot of rental agreements that are off the books per se, the bond's not lodged, possibly to avoid tax, because it creates a very clear record that you're renting your property out, and that's an offence. There's a whole list of offences throughout the Act around misleading and deceptive conduct, around not meeting minimum standards. Wherever you see in the law it says this is an offence provision, that's a ground for when you can report it to Consumer Affairs, and in most cases they do have the capacity to issue an infringement notice. Sometimes you might make the complaint and actually not know what Consumer Affairs has done. You can actually make a Freedom of Information request. Usually it costs you around $30. If you're on a pension or healthcare card, you can probably ask for a fee waiver. And that way you can use that to go to any public authority and ask for information. So it might be, I want to know what happened with my complaint. I want to know what happened to the landlord or the real estate agent. What's really critical is that people make the complaint. Just because you don't necessarily get the result you want, that information is critical for forming the new laws that goes to government that find out and says, well, what should we do here? What do renters really want? Where are the problems in the system where we need to close those loopholes? So it's certainly an exciting time, and we're really happy to see that Consumer Affairs is taking action around the minimum standards, and we look forward to more enforcement, that when I go through a red light, I know there's going to be a consequence for that. Most importantly, to protect life, most importantly, protect our homes, but also that it creates real and meaningful change, that people recognise the law is there for a reason, and that everyone should be safe. So hopefully we'll see more infringements in the future. There's also a residential non-compliance register that was introduced as part of the 2021 reforms as well. So if you do go to VCAT and there's a decision there where you think the behaviour is of particular concern, you may also want to talk to that with the VCAT members around the residential rental non-compliance register.